Welcome, brave souls, to another episode of our scary stories. I am your host, lurking in the shadows, whispering forgotten tales of horror into your ears. Tonight's story is one that will make you question the very walls that surround you. Lock your doors, dim your lights, and hold on to that comforting blanket, because you'll need all the security you can muster. We bring you a tale of voices in the dark, of malevolent entities confined but ever watchful. Get ready to meet he who whispers. Rebecca steadied her breath as she took in the grandeur of the towering Victorian house that would be her new sanctuary. Overwhelmed by the intricate architecture, she allowed her eyes to trace the elegant tracery, high gables, and ornate moldings. The creaking iron gate behind her felt like the closing chapter of her chaotic past. The cobblestone path to the massive mahogany door symbolized her path to a fresh start. With a key that felt heavy, not just in weight but in responsibility, Rebecca unlocked the front door. The hinge offered a hollow groan as she stepped inside, inviting her into a world of antiquity. Stale air, tinged with a musty scent of old books and forgotten conversations, met her lungs. It was oddly comforting, like being wrapped in an old quilt. Golden beams of the afternoon sun filtered through stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscopic patterns on the wooden floor. It was breathtaking, and Rebecca felt her tension ebb away as she immersed herself in the atmosphere. Furnished with relics from a bygone era, every piece of furniture seemed to tell a story. The maroon velvet of the armchairs had seen better days, but still beckoned invitingly. The chandelier overhead was a maze of crystal and light, giving the room an ethereal glow. Intrigued, Rebecca made her way to the fireplace. Above it hung an ornate, slightly tarnished mirror. As she peered at her reflection, she couldn't shake off the feeling that the glass had borne witness to countless secrets. Over the next few days, Rebecca settled into her new life. It was a soothing ritual: wake up to the morning light spilling through the lace curtains, savor a cup of coffee while overlooking the quaint garden, then spend the day refurbishing and exploring. Dusting off old tomes, polishing the wooden banisters, and even the mundane act of sweeping the floors became acts of catharsis. But as Rebecca endeavored to immortate herself in her daily routines, she began to notice something. Late at night, when the house was swathed in shadows and the only sound was the occasional ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, she heard it, the whispers. At first, it was merely a murmur, so faint she questioned whether it was just the wind lamenting its fate outside her window. The timbers of an old house can groan, she assured herself, attributing the noise to the age of the house, and buried herself deeper into her quilt, desperately trying to shake off the chill that was creeping into her bones. Yet the whispers persisted, a low, unintelligible utterance that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the house. When she heard it again, Rebecca sat upright, her heart racing like a trapped bird against her ribcage. The room seemed to close in on her, each inanimate object suddenly appearing menacing under the veil of darkness. The contours of the armchair twisted into grimaces, and the glow of the digital clock seemed eerily sinister. The air thickened, as if refusing to carry sound, binding her in an oppressive silence that was only broken by that inexplicable whispering. "Stop it," Rebecca muttered, her voice shaky. "It's just an old house. That's all. Nothing more." With that self-assurance, she forced her eyes shut and willed herself to be enveloped by sleep's comforting oblivion. Yet, as she drifted off, one unsettling thought plagued her. What if the whispers weren't just the house settling or her imagination playing tricks? What if the whispers were speaking to her? Her heart pounded in sync with the ticking of the grandfather clock as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, a sleep that did little to prepare her for what lay ahead. Rebecca was not yet aware, but the weight of the house's silence bore down upon her like an unspoken promise, a promise that her life was about to become entangled with the unspeakable history held within these ancient walls. The days crept by as if each were reluctant to yield to the next. Rebecca, occupied with her projects of home restoration, convinced herself that the whispers had been a fleeting trick of the mind. However, her eyes betrayed her, flickering frequently to corners of rooms, as though expecting to catch an unseen presence off guard. The morning was draped in mist, giving the world outside her windows a dreamlike quality. As Rebecca reached for a teacup from her hutch, her fingers grazed empty air. Confused, she searched and found the cup on the opposite side of the shelf, as though it had decided to relocate overnight. She was certain she hadn't put it there. A wave of unease washed over her, a sensation like walking through a spider's web, barely seen but distinctly felt. "I must be more tired than I thought," she whispered to herself, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to her ears. Just as she started to let her guard down, thinking that the unsettling incidents were flukes, the house seemed to mock her skepticism. That evening, as the vermilion hues of the sunset gave way to the encroaching darkness, she heard them again, the whispers. This time, they were clearer, as if slowly tuning into the frequency of her fear. Though the words were still indistinct, the malevolent tone was unmistakable. It was a timbre laced with intention, an auditory shiver that scuttled down her spine. That night, as Rebecca curled into her sheets, she had her first unsettling dream. She was wandering through her own home, except it was a distorted version, labyrinthine and warped. The walls pulsated like the chambers of a heart, and from them emanated the whispering voice. It was everywhere and nowhere, a pervasive sound that filled the rooms like water fills a sinking ship. She tried to scream, but her voice was trapped, a mute cry in a house of echoes. Then she woke up, her nightgown sticking to her back, wet with a cold sweat. Enough was enough. Sitting on the edge of her bed, Rebecca grabbed her phone and dialed. The call went through, and after a few rings, Sarah's voice came from the other end, tinged with surprise. "Rebecca, it's late. Is everything all right?" Sarah was an old friend from college. Studious, rational, with a degree in psychology, she was the sort of person who dissected fears, not the one who entertained them. "I need someone rational to tell me I'm not losing my mind," Rebecca blurted, her voice quivering. "Something's happening here, Sarah. In this house. I keep hearing whispers." Sarah paused, weighing her words. "Have you considered it might be stress-related? Old houses can be creepy, and you've been through a lot." "It's not just that," Rebecca insisted. "Objects are moving. I'm seeing things in my dreams that make my skin crawl. It's as if the walls are trying to talk to me." Sarah sighed, audibly conflicted between her concern for Rebecca and her natural skepticism. "All right, look, why don't I come over this weekend? We can look into it together. Worst comes to worst, we find out you have a rodent problem and I get to spend some time in a cool Victorian mansion." Though Rebecca agreed, hanging up the phone felt like clamping a lid on a pot of boiling water. Sarah's visit would offer a brief respite, but it did little to quell the sinking feeling inside her. As she tried to drift back to sleep, she couldn't shake the sensation that she wasn't alone. The whispers seemed to lurk just beyond the veil of her consciousness, a lurking presence in a house full of inanimate witnesses. Her eyes darted once more to the dark corners of her room. The veil between the rational world and the inexplicable seemed thinner than ever, and she was teetering on the edge. The whispers were there, woven into the very fabric of the house. Words still elusive, but growing bolder, as if fed by her escalating fear, and they felt eager, almost impatient. Rebecca sensed it deep within her, a lurking dread that she was no longer the sole mistress of her home. There were other occupants, unseen, unheard, but most certainly felt. Lying in her bed, Rebecca gripped her sheets tightly as if they could shield her from the encroaching dread. A realization settled upon her like an invisible shroud. The walls didn't just have ears. They had voices, and those voices were waking up. The weekend arrived with deceptive normalcy, casting its sunlight on the opulent wallpapers and intricate woodwork of the Victorian mansion. Rebecca, awaiting Sarah's arrival, couldn't help but feel a knot of anxiety form in her stomach. Would the house behave, shrouding its sinister secrets in the face of skeptical scrutiny? Sarah arrived in an old Honda, its engine struggling against the weight of years and miles. The moment she stepped inside, her eyes widened with genuine admiration. "Wow, Rebecca, this place is a treasure. You weren't exaggerating." The house, bathed in daylight, did indeed look charming. It was as if the walls, ceilings, and floors were actors, their malevolent character hidden behind the mask of architectural beauty. With a thin smile, Rebecca nodded. It's amazing what some sunshine can do. After a quick tour, they went to work setting up an array of cameras and microphones, strategically placing them in areas Rebecca felt were hot spots for the strange phenomena. Sarah, ever the rationalist, examined everything with a cautious yet open mind. "Let's test it out," Sarah suggested, her fingers syncing the devices with an app on her tablet. "We'll record through the night. Even if we don't catch any ghosts, maybe we'll find out you have some sneaky raccoons." As night unfurled its dark canvas, both women settled in the living room, their eyes darting frequently to the tablet's screen, which displayed the feeds from the cameras. The hours crept by, accompanied by the occasional creak of timber or rustle of wind-blown leaves outside. Twice, Sarah's eyebrows shot up as they heard indistinct rustling through the microphones, only to be followed by the rather unextraordinary sight of a curtain fluttering in a draft, or a door settling in its frame. Old houses do make strange sounds. It's not uncommon, Sarah said, looking up from the tablet. Rebecca bit her lip, hesitating. But it's different when you're alone. It's as though the house senses it. Sarah looked at her with a mixture of concern and disbelief. Houses don't sense, Beck. They stand. The night wore on, uneventful but thick with unspoken tension. By the time morning light crept through the curtains, both women wore expressions of exhaustion. Sarah yawned, her skepticism intact but tinged with mild disappointment. Maybe your ghosts got stage fright, she joked as they reviewed the recordings, finding them devoid of any conclusive evidence. Late Sunday afternoon, Sarah packed her equipment and offered Rebecca a tight hug. If you ever feel scared again, just call me. Though honestly, I think you're letting the atmosphere of this place mess with you. Rebecca walked her to the car and waved goodbye, a knot of dread forming the moment Sarah's car disappeared from sight. No sooner had she turned back to the house than she felt it, the weight of silence, pregnant with anticipation. She stepped inside, locking the door behind her. All right, you've got me alone. Is this what you wanted? For a moment, nothing. Then the voice spoke, its tone no longer an ambiguous whisper, but a clear, chilling articulation that curled around her like an icy draft. We knew you'd come back, Rebecca. We've been waiting for you. The room seemed to constrict, the walls closing in like an architectural vice. The voice knew her, spoke with an intimacy that tore through her deepest fears. It was no longer hiding, no longer a mere echo in the walls. I know about the fire, Rebecca. I know what you've tried to forget. Her heart raced as her mind whirled. The fire, a chapter in her life she had sealed away, shared with no one. How could it know? Her knees buckled, and she stumbled back against the door. She was chained to a house that not only whispered but knew her, knew the dark chapters of her life she'd never read aloud. The malevolent force within the walls had laid its invisible chains, and as they tightened, Rebecca felt an irrevocable truth settle in. She was not alone in her secrets, and she was not alone in her home. For lurking within the very bones of the house was an entity that had awoken, and it knew her name. Dusk unfurled its pitch-black curtain over the sky as Rebecca found herself sitting in her armchair, her fingers white-knuckled on its worn arms. The evening's settling darkness felt different now, as though it were a tangible entity, thick and suffocating. Her eyes, almost against her will, kept drifting toward the walls, the very walls that had come alive with Nathaniel's insidious voice. Who are you? She finally murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. And why are you here? For a long moment, the house remained silent. Then came Nathaniel's voice, as clear as if he were in the room with her, so different from the unsettling whispers of before. His tone was almost melodic, hypnotically soothing. I am Nathaniel, bound within these walls. I was a misunderstood soul, much like you, Rebecca. Misjudged, wronged, imprisoned in this house even in death. As he spoke, Rebecca felt the tension in her shoulders slowly unwind. There was a gentle sadness in his voice that resonated with her own buried sorrows. Could it be that he was as much a victim as she was? Your secrets, Rebecca, Nathaniel continued, they are safe with me. I know the fire, the pain, the shame. We are kindred spirits, trapped in different ways. What do you want? She asked, her voice tinged with caution but also a dangerous glimmer of empathy. I desire freedom, Nathaniel said. I want to taste the air of the world outside these walls, to feel the moonlight on my skin. In return, I can offer you something you've long sought, redemption. A second chance, unburdened by your past. Rebecca's mind raced. Could it be so simple? A whispered promise of freedom and redemption, a balm for wounds that had never truly healed. Yet even as she hesitated, a chill slithered down her spine. And how do I know I can trust you? She asked, steeling herself for the answer. It was as if a switch had flipped. The temperature in the room plummeted, replacing Nathaniel's warm undertones with something darker, more menacing. Trust, Nathaniel snarled. How dare you speak of trust when the world has turned its back on you? You will free me, Rebecca, or you will know torment far beyond your darkest nightmares. As if to punctuate his threat, the room trembled. A violent force swept through, hurling a vase from a side table, shattering it against the far wall. Books flew off shelves, their pages flapping wildly before crumpling to the floor. Light bulbs flickered before bursting, casting the room into murky gloom. Rebecca screamed, shielding her face from the shards of flying glass. As quickly as it had begun, the whirlwind ceased, leaving her in a room transformed into a landscape of disarray and brokenness. "You see what I am capable of," Nathaniel hissed, the walls themselves seeming to vibrate with his malevolence. "I can be your savior or your destroyer. The choice is yours." The full, terrifying reality settled upon Rebecca. Nathaniel, this thing, this spirit or demon, was not a misunderstood soul. He was a malevolent entity, ancient and terrible, bound by unseen forces within the very walls that framed her home. He spoke not just to manipulate her emotions, but to seize her will, to turn her into the key that would unshackle his dark essence upon the world. What she did next could damn her or save her. And as she stood amid the shattered remnants of her once peaceful sanctuary, Rebecca knew that her life had become an inescapable labyrinth. At its center lurked Nathaniel, he who whispered promises and threats, he who held her secrets like a weapon, he who would be either her salvation or her utter ruin. Rebecca's days twisted into a disorienting blur of hours dominated by an unsettling undercurrent of dread. The sunlight filtering through her Victorian home's heavy drapes seemed jaundiced, devoid of warmth, as though the sun itself was withholding its grace. Nightfall came too soon, each day a sprint towards inevitable darkness. She felt trapped, a captive to the walls that had seen centuries pass, walls that now whispered dark entreaties in Nathaniel's voice. In a desperate bid to uncover the reality of the force that held her hostage, she ascended the narrow, creaking staircase leading to the attic. Her hand trembled on the knob before she pushed the door open, revealing a room submerged in stagnant air and shrouded in shadows. It was as though she had stepped into the dusty lungs of the house. Ignoring the unease that churned in her stomach, Rebecca began her search, rummaging through piles of old trunks and forgotten heirlooms, swiping layers of dust-off yellowed papers and faded photographs. Finally, her eyes landed on a pile of tattered newspapers and brittle journals. As she read, her hands began to quiver. Nathaniel Keats, arrested for gruesome murders, one headline screamed. Her eyes devoured accounts of unspeakable atrocities, and sepia-toned photographs stared back at her, the faces of women and men whose lives were snuffed out in the bloom of their existence. "You found my memoirs," Nathaniel's voice slithered into the room, as disdainful as it was amused. "You're a monster," she spat out, her voice tinged with revulsion. "Or a liberator. I took their meaningless lives and transformed their pain into art. Just as we could do with your life, Rebecca," he replied. His words sank into her thoughts, intertwining with her fears, her regrets, and her darkest desires. "You're weighed down by your past, by the judgments of insignificant people. I can free you just as you can free me. We can rise, transcendent, unburdened." The proposition carried a twisted allure. Wasn't she already a pariah, mired in guilt and suppressed memories? Her heart pounded in her chest as Nathaniel whispered the final, unthinkable proposal, a ritual to free him, to tear down the walls of his spiritual prison and forge a new destiny for them both. Drawn almost against her will, Rebecca found herself gathering the ingredients: a silver chalice filled with rainwater, a ring of salt around an intricately chalked pentagram, and at its center, an old locket containing a strand of her hair. The air grew dense, her breaths coming in shallow gasps as she lit the circle of candles that completed the pentagram. A shiver of anticipation ran down her spine. "Speak the words I've taught you," Nathaniel urged, the walls themselves vibrating with a frenetic energy that seemed to beckon the surrounding darkness into the room. As she began to chant in an ancient tongue she barely understood, the air thickened into a viscous mass, as if time itself was grinding to a halt. Objects around her levitated, trembling in the charged atmosphere. The boundary between the material world and the realm Nathaniel occupied grew thin, fraying at the edges. Just as she uttered the final incantation, a gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles and scattering the chalked lines of the pentagram. Rebecca felt her willpower snap back into place as if waking from a trance. Her eyes widened in horror at the realization of what she was doing, of what she was unleashing. "No, this ends now," she screamed, her voice breaking the unnatural stillness, her words a rejection, a sealing of the doorway that had nearly been thrown wide open. For a moment, the house quivered, as though caught in an earthquake. Nathaniel roared in frustration, the sound echoing like thunderclaps within the walls. "You dare defy me. You will regret this, Rebecca." His voice shattered into 1,000 echoes, each a shard of malevolent intent. As the room settled back into its previous state, Rebecca trembled, aware of how close she had come to crossing an irrevocable threshold. She had glimpsed the abyss, had nearly been consumed by it. And even as she stepped away from the ruined pentagram, from the malevolent force that was Nathaniel, Rebecca knew that her fight was far from over. The darkness had been held at bay, but it still lurked at the edges of her world, forever whispering, forever waiting. The air in the Victorian home was so tense it felt like a bowstring drawn taut, ready to snap. Rebecca had only moments before averted the ritual that would free Nathaniel, the monstrous spirit confined within these walls. But she knew she was treading on a razor's edge. "You will regret your defiance, Rebecca," Nathaniel hissed, the menace in his voice making the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She rushed downstairs to the study, her hands trembling as they searched frantically through a pile of musty, age-worn books on ancient rituals and spells she'd found earlier, but dismissed as superstitious nonsense. Now they were her only hope. She knew she needed to fortify the spiritual barriers of the house, to trap Nathaniel even more firmly within its walls. But how? Her eyes fell on an incantation meant to seal spirits into objects or places. Her pulse quickened as she scanned the lines. This was it, her last chance to contain Nathaniel and protect the world from his malevolence. But just as she began to read the incantation, the room exploded into chaos. Books flew off shelves like angry hornets, lamps shattered, sending shards of glass spiraling through the air. The very house seemed to convulse in Nathaniel's rage. Rebecca stumbled, a splinter of glass cutting across her cheek, drawing blood. Her eyes met her reflection in a shard of a broken mirror. Blood trickled down her face, but it was her eyes that held her attention. Fearful, yes, but also resolute. With a renewed sense of purpose, she clutched the book against her chest and began reciting the incantation, her voice rising above the storm Nathaniel had conjured. The words felt heavy on her tongue, each syllable a leaden weight, but she pushed forward. "You cannot contain me. I will not be bound," Nathaniel roared. The walls trembled, the air grew icy, and Rebecca felt a crushing pressure against her chest, as if invisible hands were trying to squeeze the life out of her. She wavered, gasping for air, but forced herself to continue. "I sealed thee into the very fibers of this dwelling. Let the walls be your eternal cage," she shouted, finishing the incantation with a guttural cry. An almost inhuman wail filled the house, a sound so filled with agony and rage that it seemed to come from the bowels of the earth itself. And then, just as suddenly, silence, a heavy, expectant silence that felt like a blanket smothering the room. It was over. Nathaniel was sealed further into the very structure of the house, bound to its walls, confined within its rooms. But Rebecca felt no sense of triumph, only exhaustion and an overwhelming sadness. She knew that her life, too, was now irrevocably bound to this house. As long as Nathaniel remained trapped, she would have to remain vigilant. The house was quiet, but it was a malevolent silence, tinged with dread and anticipation. She touched her cut cheek, her fingers coming away red. The room lay in ruins around her, a testament to the struggle that had just unfolded. She looked out the window at the world she had just saved but would now forever be apart from. "I will be watching, Nathaniel, and I will be waiting," she whispered to the walls around her. They offered no reply, but she felt it, the presence of Nathaniel lurking in the background, watching, waiting, forever whispering in the dark recesses of the house. Rebecca knew her life had changed, her future bound to an endless vigil. She would never be free, but neither would Nathaniel. And for now, that would have to be enough. As she stepped away from the shattered remnants of her old life, Rebecca realized that her battle against Nathaniel had become her life's purpose. The house was no longer just a residence. It was an eternal battleground, its walls a prison not just for Nathaniel, but for her as well. And so she would remain in this silent house filled with whispers, forever on guard, her life a tenuous line between the world and the unspeakable evil that sought to break free. As the echoing silence settles, we conclude tonight's chilling tale. May the walls of your own home feel a little less confining and a lot more protective. But remember, brave souls, our story tonight is but a whisper in the darkness of the unknown. Keep your ears open, for you never know when the next whisper might be meant for you. Thank you for venturing into the abyss with us, and until next time, remember, it's our stories that make us, but some stories can unmake you. This is our Scary Stories signing off for tonight.